And it maybe started in the 60s with an American doctor called Ansel Keys.
Yeah.
And people don't realise that that's where the fat phobia started.
Correct. Absolutely. And so Ansel Keys was a crook because he hid data. He hid data on polyunsaturated fats. He did the Minnesota coronary experiment, which was done. It was one of the best intervention studies ever done. And when it showed that replacing saturated fat with polyunsaturated fat made no difference. In fact, the people over 65 did worse on the diet. They just hid it.
Yeah.
And if that had come out in 1974, as it should have done, the dietary guidelines in 1976, they couldn't have come out that way. Because people would say, but hold it, there's been a clinical trial that disproves it.
And that was hidden till, was it 1 or 2 years ago?
That's correct.
And his original study in the 60s, we can call it a study, where he manipulated the data of the 7 countries, or was it 6 countries? I can't remember.
There was 6 and then 7,
Yeah, but there was actually data to, was it 18 or 20 countries?
Correct. And there's a paper out which I discovered recently in which what he had was 2 populations of countries, one with a low fat intake and low heart disease rates, and then about 15 countries with variable heart disease rates and the same and higher levels of fat intake. And statistically, they worked out that he took 4 from the small group and 3 from the big group. And that was the only way he could get a statistical result.
Because he wanted to show a previous hypothesis that the more saturated fat you disease, the higher cholesterol, the more chance you've got of dying of heart disease.
So the statistician concluded that he had manipulated the data to make sure he got 4 of those points and 3 of these points, and he got a statistical relationship. And it was almost the only way you could get a statistical relationship. Was that by chance? We'll never know.
But if he'd taken the data from all the countries that are available, we probably wouldn't be having this conversation today.
Well, in fact, the data today show the reverse. That if you look at 48 European countries, the more fat in the diet, the less heart disease, and the more polyunsaturated fat in the diet, the higher the heart disease. So had he used those data today, he would have had to say the opposite. If you replace saturated fat with polyunsaturated fat, you increase your heart disease rates.
Yeah. And if we go back to the study you were talking about in the early 70s, that was where he did it with the mental patients, because you could control exactly what they were eating, and was it 3,000 of them?
Yeah, at least, yeah.
And they followed them for several years, and he wanted to use this to prove his hypothesis again, and it showed actually the opposite. So what they did was bind it until somebody accidentally found it.
That's correct. And that would have changed the world, and we would not have had the diabetes obesity epidemic that we have now, which is the greatest medical error in history. And unfortunately, it's going to explode sometime. And people are going to have to stand up and say, I'm sorry, I was the cause of the problem. Yeah.
So this is really the crux of where we are today. Yeah. Much of what we've been told has been manipulated by industry, or manipulated by people wanting to promote their own hypothesis.
Correct.
And you experienced that in a very hard and interesting way in the last couple of years. Could you explain what happened there?
Yeah. So I became active on Twitter in about 2012. So
Donald's not the only one that's active on Twitter.
And I was told by my friend Lewis Pugh, who we took to the North Pole, he swam 1 kilometer at the North Pole in ice cold water. And it was a project over about 3 years, and we became very close. And he was on Twitter and became active, and he said, Tim, really, if you want to take your message to the world, you have to be on Twitter. And so I started, and I didn't have any clue what to do, but eventually it took off, and so I became more active on it. And in February 2014, I responded to a Twitter comment, and I suggested that mothers should wean their children onto high-fat, low-carbohydrate diets, because that's the key time when you really want to get fat into it.
For the development of the brain.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And this, within 12 hours, I was reported to the Health Professional Council of South Africa. And there was no basis for the complaint, but then it escalated. My university got strongly involved in it and helped drive the process against me. It went to a preliminary committee who were clearly biased against me. And again, there were members of my university who were involved in that. So that you begin to question what's going on here. And instead of throwing the complaint out, they asked for other people to give their opinions. They had 3 major documents, which I never saw. And that's against their rules. You have to, I should have been able to answer all those 3 documents. One of them was fraudulent. It's called the Nordia meta-analysis, and it appears to be fraudulent. We showed with Zoe Harcom from Wales, we analysed it and we found that there were 14 material errors in which it looked like the data had been manipulated, had come from one study, but when we saw it published in the Nordia study, it looked wrong. And we made that point, and they couldn't answer. They couldn't explain why they got these errors. So there were the 3 documents which I never saw, and then I was charged. And so what they thought would be a 2-day trial turned out to be a 26-day trial, costing, we estimate, some easily 10 million rand, of which 3/4 was for the doctors of South Africa to pay, and the other quarter was for myself and my team. And it would have been much more for me because I had 2 senior counsel who gave their time for free. That would have been another 5 or 6 or 7 million rand. And it went on for 26 days, and in the end I won on every count. There were 10 decisions made by the committee, and I won on all of them. So it was a 10-0, and it was the only conclusion they could have come to. See, what they were trying to do was to shut down doctors who are giving information on social media. They try to claim that as soon as you enter the social media space, you're in a doctor-patient relationship. So if someone asks you a question, it doesn't matter if it's an I or a we question, because we recognize if you're in a public space and a patient asks you an I question, you don't answer it. Say, doctor, should I take XY drugs? You don't answer that question, because it's supersession. You're superseding the doctor, and also you're not examining a patient. So how can you? I would answer that question, well, if you use these drugs, these are the benefits and these are the risks. That's the way you can answer it, because you're not answering it directly. But if the doctor, if someone says to me, we, which was what my question was, is should we do this? Then you're perfectly allowed to do that. What they were trying to say was that I'd answered a we question, and that made me a doctor-patient relationship, and I'd failed in the doctor-patient relationship. And that is nonsensical. For a couple of reasons, but firstly, Twitter is a space of information sharing. It's not medical care. If someone wants medical care, they write to you, or they say on Twitter, Dr. Noaks, how can I contact you for a medical consultation? And that's fine. And then you'd go through the normal processes, and that would then become a doctor-patient relationship. But even if someone on Twitter says, Dr. Noaks, should I run a marathon to prevent heart disease? There's no reason why you shouldn't answer that question, even though it's a direct question, and even though you haven't examined the patient. Because it's Twitter, because that person's then going to say, okay, now I'm going to ask somebody else. And also, if I give the wrong answer, someone else is going to say, no, Dr. Noaks, you shouldn't say that. And they do that all the time, every day. So when this question was asked, in fact, 2 dietitians answered, Dr. Noaks is wrong. You mustn't follow his advice. You must do this. Please come and consult me. And so they did all supersession and everything, but they were never charged. So in the end, I won the case. But they've tried to appeal it, but I don't know on what grounds they're appealing it, because there was not even one minor suggestion that the case was wrong. But had we lost, this is what would have happened. The Health Professional Council in South Africa would now have complete control of all social media. And any doctor who says anything on social media could go through what I did. And they wanted to make it as uncomfortable for me as possible.
Did they not want to take away your medical license?
Well, that was potentially what they could have done. But I haven't practiced medicine for 15 years. So it didn't make any difference to me. And I could have stopped. You see, I could have said, listen, I'm revoking my license. There were reasons why I still kept my registration, but they were not irrelevant. I could have just given my registration away and not gone through the trial. But I said, no, they're trying to destroy me. That's what it was all about, too. There were 2 goals. Firstly, to publicly humiliate me and destroy my entire career. And the second one was to shut any doctor, because if they could take me out, and in the documents it says, he's a celebrity, we've got to act against him. Yeah. That was the focus. Yeah. So it was very tough, but we won. In the end.
2.5 years?
It was, in fact, more like 3 years.
3 years to clear your name.
Yeah. But now we've written a book which has been finished. Now it's coming out in November. And then, the public will see, oh my gosh, how could this have happened? How could a university be captured to the extent that it wants to publicly humiliate one of its best scientists